Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the afternoon session of our first conference day. I want to introduce our Saturday keynote speaker, Renee Lertzman. She's an author, teacher, consultant, and public speaker. Renee Lertzman teaches psychology of environmental education and communication in the MA program at Royal Roads University in British Columbia. Ms. Lertzman's work focuses on the intersection of psychology, environmental, and culture to help organizations, governments, and businesses devise communication and engagement strategies for the uniquely challenging nature of environmental work. Her latest book is Environmental Melancholia, Psychoanalytic Dimensions of Engagement. Renee's 1.5-hour presentation and workshop to help their volunteers bring emotional intelligence to the tough communications surrounding carbon pricing in June 2016. We are thrilled she agreed to be our Saturday keynote speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, Renee Lertzman, please get a hand for her.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. I've got a pretty bad echo on my end, so I don't know if there's anything. Okay, that's better. Awesome. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. All right. I can't actually, let me see if I can try to see you all. Oh, there we go. Okay. All right. So I'm really excited to be virtually with you today. It's a little surreal, as you can imagine, with my sitting here in my living room talking with you, but we're gonna work the magic of the internet and energetically be together for this hour and a half. It's a huge honor to be able to engage with you all. I've shared this with a number of CCL people, but basically Citizens Climate Lobby is, it's like my soul, oops, it was my cat. My soulmate of an organization. You know, it's like if I were to think about an organization where I just, the essence of what it's about is really gets at the essence of what I think our work in climate change advocacy needs to be. So I'm just really honored and thrilled. I'd like this time that we have, it's very precious, to be as valuable and meaningful for you as possible. My intention for this time is that we have, you know, ideally as much talking as there is interacting and questions. So that's the intention for today. And what I've found in doing, working with groups and organizations around this material is that there is a bit of groundwork or foundations that's really important for us to get grounded in order for the how to, the kind of what do we do with this to make any sense. And even though there's a lot of, you know, that this is a very applied context, that we're all here not to just theorize and kind of talk about conceptual frameworks. We're really here to make change happen. I understand that there's a tension between those things. And we're going to work and be in that tension as much as possible. We're going to kind of stay in that place where I'm inviting you to really step into the first, I would say, 20 minutes or so at the most of just talking through some content and the rationale for why it's integral, it's imperative right now that we begin to infuse our work in climate change, whether you're working in policy, whether you're working in sciences, whatever area you're working in, that we infuse it with a, as was mentioned earlier, emotional intelligence, compassion, empathy, and to really recognize that looking at the emotional dimensions of climate change is not, it's not extra. It's not something sort of, you know, cool or interesting. It's actually, it's essential for how we can be more effective. So I'm going to talk through for about 20 minutes, and then we're going to attempt to do some interactive activities. And I understand that Kathy's around and folks are around to kind of help sort of facilitate or moderate that. and then we'll go back into a little bit more of a talk, and then we'll have ideally lots of time for discussion and questions. Okay? So I'm going to go ahead and get started. The first thing I want to just begin with as a point of sort of a key concept that we're going to be looking at here is just that climate change is fundamentally a psychological and an emotional issue. And the task and the challenge that we have is to think about our work through that lens. So I'm saying that very sort of deliberately and kind of at the top right now, because I've been working in this space for a number of years. And at the moment, we're just beginning to sort of get a handle on what this means. But for the most part, when we talk about addressing climate change issues, it tends to be sort of absent of a recognition of what does this, how does this affect us psychologically and emotionally, and what does that mean for our policy work and our communications work. So I want to just put that out there very clearly that it is. And then the second part of that is the implications of that is that it means that our work has to become more attentive to how to have better conversations, right? How to really listen and practice the empathy. And the challenge is that when the stakes are so high with these kinds of issues, it's really hard to have empathy and to listen. So when the stakes are high and there's so much on the line, it becomes almost impossible to kind of take a step back and do this kind of work that is ultimately very helpful. And that is what the title of this talk, The Paradox, is really about. It's a paradox that sometimes, not always, there's a place for taking a stand and having protests is happening in Standing Rock, and there's also a place for learning how to have conversation and to listen. So the question is, how can psychology help us navigate this terrain? What does that mean? What does that look like? That's really our question that I'm inviting us and asking us to think about. Now, I want to start out, this is my version of a disclaimer. And this disclaimer is saying, I, along with everyone else who's doing this kind of work, love to tell people basically what we need to do. And I love to talk. I'm going to try not to talk too much today, but I love to talk to people. I love to lecture. I'm a trained educator. I'm a professor at times, not all the time, but this is my disclaimer to say that I need this work as much as anyone else, that we're all in this together. And what this means, it means thinking about how we communicate in our role as lobbyists a little bit differently. So I want to start with talking a bit about the landscape. Okay, so the landscape meaning this field that we're in, the interface of psychology, environment, and climate change work. So some of you may be aware that there has been a number of books coming out and initiatives and programs and events and so forth coming out in recent years. We've got George Marshall's book, Don't Even Think About It. And I'm going to talk about in a bit about kind of the differences from across these different approaches, to some degree. We've got a new book by Jeff Keel. Jeff was a senior scientist at National Center for Atmospheric Research in the U.S., then trained to be a Jungian psychoanalyst, has left his position as a scientist and is now essentially a full-time Jungian analyst. It's a really wonderful book. We've got a wonderful collection of essays that came out a few years ago, edited by Sally Weintraub in the UK, Engaging with Climate Change, which is based on a 2-day conference at the Institute of Psychoanalysis in London. We have Per Stoknes' book, which is also came out very recently, What We Think About When We Try Not to Think About Global Warming. He's Norwegian, and he's a scientist, or computer scientist basically, turned psychologist. So we're seeing quite a bit of this shifting going on where people who have been trained in different fields and disciplines are now moving more towards training up and skilling up in psychology because we need to, because it's really at that place where it's time for us to recognize the human dimension of dealing with these issues. And all of us need to be as skilled and knowledgeable and, literate about these dimensions as much as you would expect someone to know about the science, the technology, and the policy. And so my work, so it's been mentioned that I have this book, Environmental Melancholia. It's an academic book. I don't know if any of you have tried to look it up, but it's an expensive monograph. It is coming out in paperback next month. And I'm working on a trade version that's more for just kind of everyday people working on climate change. But the essence of this book, I could spend a lot of time talking about this, and I'm not going to today. But the essence here is that based on designing my research using conversation and a lot of listening, and the research was conducted in the Great Lakes region in Wisconsin, I really heard in what people were sharing with me about their views and perceptions about climate change. I was surprised that there was really a mood or a tenor of loss. There was a sense of what I call melancholia. So there was a sense of something has changed, something's been lost, but it's not really articulated and clearly defined. And what that does is it tends to undermine many people's sense of agency or efficacy in getting involved. And so the book really addresses what we can do about that in terms of how we have to absolutely reframe the ways that we're used to thinking about our work in climate, away from thinking that it's about needing to motivate people and needing to get people to care more. And it's actually about learning to recognize what's getting in the way. What's getting in the way from people's ability to really engage with these issues. And that's exactly what we're going to be looking at. So another research project I was involved with a few years ago with the Skoll Global Threats Fund, which is an American foundation. They have a website called the Climate Advocacy Lab. And several years ago, they asked me to basically do a research, kind of a literature review of what does the social sciences and psychology say about climate change. And what I did instead, I kind of did a slightly, kind of took a sidestep. What I found in doing my research is that there are 4 primary kind of areas right now that characterize the way that people are thinking about climate change engagement and behavior change. And I want to go through those very briefly. And this may seem kind of, a step back, but I would say that it's really important for all of us to be as grounded, as I mentioned, in sort of this landscape. This is the landscape we're sort of in right now. It's a bit simplistic, but bear with me. The first part of the landscape is a focus on behavior change. So this is really where you hear a lot about nudging. You all familiar with nudging? And taking sort of a behavioral economic approach to engaging with people. It's sort of focusing on what are the levers, what are the drivers. Something called community-based social marketing really has a foothold in this space where, if we create green teams and make people champions, it sort of has that focus on getting people to do X or Y. The second part of the quadrant is a framing focus, and that's really strong in the policy world. I'm sure that many of you are familiar with framing work, where how do we talk about climate change in terms of the frame, so values-based framing, so whether it's health, whether it's family, whether it's future generations, whether it's financial viability, whether it's being competitive. These are all frames. And this is a very particular way of approaching engaging people with climate. And it's this kind of George Marshall's work, and his organization is very strong in framing. The third is a systems level approach, right? So some of you may be familiar with programs that are organized around challenges to spark and generate innovation. So sort of the accelerator model. But it also, this is getting at the design kind of social, I don't know if you're familiar with the sort of social innovation, social design work. And people who work in this space tend to really focus on that more system level change. And the fourth part of this quadrant is the emotional part. And the emotional part is really asking this question, you know, how are people relating with these issues from an emotional level experientially? So this, we see more of this coming out in arts-based advocacy, right? Arts-based projects, conversation, carbon conversations, listening projects, the kind of work that I do. You know, this is really sort of the area that is emerging and becoming more and more recognized as integral. And so what I want to just say about this quadrant here is it's really a map of the landscape, and that it's incredibly important that we find ways to connect all of these together. So I'm not saying that any one of these is more important or less important than the other. I'm saying that in the work that we do, it's really helpful to recognize when are we kind of in one or two of those areas more than others, and to kind of take a step back and think, okay, you know, how might I need to bring something else into the work that I'm doing? So this is sort of the quadrant that I use, and I use this in virtually every project, because it's just helpful for people to have this map. And so what we're going to focus on today is really diving a bit more deeply into the emotional dimension of climate change and what that means for you in the work that you're trying to do as lobbyists and communicators. So we're going to talk now about affect and emotion. So why is this so important, right? So why does this matter? One of the things that we're doing here in this work is that we're kind of fixing or repairing a split that's been going on for a really long time between the mind and the heart, or the cognitive and the experiential. There's many ways that we can talk about this. There's the kind of mind behavior gap, or the attitude behavior gap. It's something that's been going on for a number of years, particularly in, well, basically many disciplines, social sciences, where, you know, we're starting to recognize people aren't rational, right? So we've seen work that's, you know, more and more work's coming out that's really kind of driving this home. Frankly, psychoanalysts and psychologists have known this for many, many years, for over 100 years, that humans are not rational. We're driven by all kinds of unconscious drivers and motivations. However, now, thanks to neuroscience and all kinds of innovative research, we have more basis for saying, actually, this is true. And let's actually take a finer, more granular look at this. So Kahneman, you know, Thinking Fast and Slow is an example of this, but I want to really urge us to go beyond the framework of thinking fast and slow, to be a bit more nuanced, and to think about how this specifically relates to climate change. And I would say that climate change has its own unique kind of psychology, and it's not necessarily the psychology that we think it is. You know, a lot of work right now that is looking at the psychology of climate change, in my view, it focuses on, you know, oh, it's too long term, it's too abstract, it's too systemic. All of that might be true to some degree. What we're not looking at is the emotional and the affective. And affect is a clinical term that simply refers to the feeling that you get in your body. It's a visceral feeling that you're not necessarily conscious of. So right now, for example, there's an affect in the room that you're in. I would love to know what it is. I have a feeling it's really probably pretty charged, pretty energetic, pretty, there's probably a lot of kind of sense of motivation, because I've been at CCL meetings before, and there's just this incredible sense of, we're going to do this, we're going to rock it, we're going to make stuff happen. And so that's my guess, is that that's that affect. Affect is a really useful concept to use in our work. You can start to pay attention to, what's the affect in the room when I'm having an interaction with someone? What's the affect that I'm feeling from this person in this interaction? Just kind of train ourselves to become more tuned in. So some of the feelings and emotions that may come up for people in relation to climate change, this is like, just took me about 10 seconds to throw some some thoughts out here, and I'm sure you all have a lot more to add. You know, really coming to terms with these issues can bring up despair for people. It can bring up shame and guilt because we're all still imbricated, right? We're all still embedded in the systems that we're trying to change. And that can really bring up an incredible sense of shame and guilt, even though that may or may not be warranted, but that can come up. It can bring up a lot of conflict. All of us deal and negotiate with conflict just as a byproduct of becoming more aware of our effects on climate through carbon and so forth. I mean, it's really almost impossible. And I'm going to talk about this in a minute, the concept of ambivalence that I've learned from psychoanalysis. Powerlessness. So, you know, again, a lot of this may not be at a conscious level, but it can sort of be in the background. It can kind of come up for people. Now, why does this matter? It matters because all information processing is emotional. This is so firmly grounded in neuroscience that we can't separate the emotions from the way that we process information. So if we think about this, really think about this, ideally this puts a new lens on how we do our work as educators, advocates, and communicators. Because it means that our ability cognitively to absorb and process and integrate the kind of information that we need to be taking in about the human impact on our environment and our planet is actually impaired. It's actually impeded by the emotional and the affective dimensions that may be aroused. So again, if we just kind of remember that this is grounded in how the brain processes, we've got the limbic system here. I'm sure many of you know about or familiar with the limbic system, the survival. So we're talking about the flight, fright, or freeze kind of domain that we're in, right? And my fantasy is that the climate community just takes us on and is like, okay, how do we work with this given what we know about the human, right? How do we work with this? And that is a place of innovation and creativity for all of us. So I wanted to share with you a couple of meaningful excerpts from some research that just kind of really drives this home. So if we think about it, affect directs our attention, it guides our decision making, stimulates learning, and it triggers our behavior. This is a team of neuroscientists. This is really, just think about what this means. Just think about the implications of this. And this I really like. This is a colleague of mine, Marshall Alcorn in DC. He wrote a book called Resistance to Learning. And, you know, it basically just kind of states the situation we're in. So if a mind thinks of new information and in that moment experiences anxiety, fear, anger, or shame, that new information may not be effectively integrated. So just imagine kind of the implications of that. And this is just kind of takes it on to what happens when we avoid information, right? When we can't kind of process. If we're confronted with some new information that doesn't fit the model, our mind relies on defense mechanisms to deny, repress, confabulate anything to preserve the status quo. Now, does that sound familiar to any of you? So what does this mean in terms of defense mechanisms and how people deal with this? So we've got conflicting desires here, right? We've got everyone we're talking to has conflicting desires, I would maintain. I actually believe that some of you may disagree. I believe that all humans have a fundamental need and desire to be living in a habitable world that supports future generations, but that there's conflicts around short-term gains, insecurities, fears, and so forth. So what happens when there's these conflicts, there's often denial of the problem in the first place. There's disavowal, and disavowal is different from denial. Disavowal is very common, where we basically say, I'm not denying that that's the case, I'm just simply going to choose not to know about it, or I'm going to choose to not be aware of it. It's not as active as saying climate change isn't real or it's not true. It's actually saying I'm going to actually just kind of put that aside for now. And rationalizing is really another common defense mechanism where we just go on and on and on and on about whatever rationalizations we need. Now, I think it's really important to, you know, my ideal outcome of this is that hopefully this can spark some, it might be a tiny little flame of compassion for the incredible conundrum that we're in at the moment, right? And so when we're confronted with these things, right, with denial, disavowal, and rationalization, when we're confronted, of course, the first thing we want to do is to make it go away, to fight it, to argue with it, to push against it. But in actuality, that doesn't necessarily work very well when we're working with these dynamics, okay? So what we're talking about here is that there's some suffering and there's some pain going on that leads people to engage in these behaviors and in these defense mechanisms. And, you know, I'm just sharing some artwork by an American artist named Jill Pelto, who bases her artwork on climate science data. I just like to include artwork in my presentations because it just kind of helps connect us with the affective, with the almost the realm of climate change that's almost beyond words. And I want to encourage us to not be afraid of this, to not be afraid to acknowledge that this can be hard, that this can be painful, that our ability to engage with this, to kind of just let it in and not necessarily, you know, stay permanently there, really enhances our resilience. It really enhances our abilities to be leaders and to be skillful and intelligent and thoughtful, lovely communicators, to kind of just see if we can create some space for this, right? And to notice our own relationship with our own suffering and our own pain, as well as our motivation, all that stuff. But we're really looking at creating a lot of space here for containing this, to kind of just be with it. So if I was in the room with you at this point, I would say, you guys know, you with me here? And I'd be able to see pretty clearly where people are at, but I'm going to just let you know, I'm just checking, energetically checking in with you here. Okay, so the next part that I'm going to focus on, and then we're going to do a very brief activity, is something called the 3 A's. So some of you may remember this from the last CCL workshop we did that Kathy hosted. The 3 A's is something I came up with that I find really can be very helpful for people working in this space. And you can think about this as a bit of an emotional navigator, a way to kind of direct yourself and tune into where people are at. So the first A is anxiety. And this anxiety can be about all kinds of things, but it's like acknowledging that talking about climate and energy and environmental degradation, it is anxiety producing. I mean, that's just the reality. Let's just face it, it's anxiety producing. And I think it's important to just recognize that, you know, it's just part of the deal. And what happens with anxiety is people defend it. People go into defense mechanisms. So we need to learn how to work with anxiety. So I want to just kind of acknowledge that there's anxiety. It could be about, you know, what's going to happen to my kids. It's going to be about food. It could be about God knows what. I mean, it really is very unique. It's very personal. It's culturally, socially, politically, economically influenced what the anxieties are going to be. The ambivalence here is, well, I just feel like I'm in such a double bind. You know, that's what ambivalence is. Ambivalence is you simultaneously feel so pulled. And a number of my students at Royal Roads have done amazing master's theses where they do in-depth interviews with Canadians all around the country around different topics: transportation, the oil sands or the tar sands industry, people working in leadership and social change, all kinds of amazing areas that they've worked on in the country. And they find over and over again that ambivalence and the double bind is really big. And it keeps people paralyzed. It keeps people kind of stuck in terms of, I don't, what am I going to do? It's like, I'm a mom, I have to drive my kids around, or whatever that is. Depending on the context. And aspiration is really that part of us that, what we really aspire for. And this may or may not be related to climate change. It could be, I want to be a good parent. I want to be a good citizen. I want to, make sure that my grandchildren are thriving. I want to make sure I can provide for my family. I want to have a habitable, healthy planet. I want to protect that place that we go for the summers. I mean, that's the aspiration. And our job is to learn how to really listen and acknowledge those anxieties and the ambivalence in the people, in ourselves, and in the people that we're talking to before we move right into aspiration. And one of the limitations of our work tends to be that we want to move quickly to the solutions. We want to move quickly to why this is going to benefit you and all the positive reasons why. And what I'm saying is that when we leave out the anxiety and the ambivalence and move just to aspiration, we're not actually bringing people along with us in the way that we need to. So I want to just have us do a brief interactivity right now. And this is a way to practice the 3 A's. So what I want you to do first is, if you could identify a partner. So first get into a partner, and then I'm going to give you the next directions. Okay, so this is the first part, is for people to take a few minutes and reflect on someone in particular, an MP or someone that they're needing to connect with. And I want them to reflect on what are their potential anxieties, what are the potential ambivalences, and what are the potential aspirations. And I want them to take a few moments and just jot this down. And then in pairs, they, take turns. So need for now the other partner to acknowledge what they heard the other person say.
Okay.